Well, all I can say is I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to see all of you here. I'm sorry if you've got anything more interesting to do on a Friday afternoon, please go ahead and do it. But when I was asked to give this talk, I couldn't resist doing it because I love telling stories and I love telling secrets that may not be secrets, but we'll find out. I have spent most of my life in architecture. In fact, I think I can say I've honestly spent all of my life in architecture. As Kush said, I am a third-generation architect. My father was an architect, my grandfather was an architect, and my son was a computer science student here. And quit after second year to join a startup. I guess you know this story. But this building has a whole multi-layered connection with me. And so I don't want this talk to be about me. I want it to be about the building. But I have to come into the story because, I mean, I am going to narrate it, and it is from my point of view. And I have been an architect since I was born. I mean, the Ontario Association of Architects wouldn't accept that statement. But as far as I'm concerned, I've been an architect since I was born. I never thought of doing anything else with my life but being an architect. And my darling mother once said, I can't tell whether you're going to be an architect or a politician, and because my grandfather, one was an architect, one was a politician, and then she more recently said, I figured it out, you're a university professor, so you can be both an architect and a politician. And that's what I am. As I will recount in just a minute, I came to this university as an undergraduate in 1969, and architecture brought me here. So I've watched this campus grow and change, and with great amusement most of the time, and a little bit of alarm more recently, about which I'll say a few words at the end. But I would like to remind everyone of a few simple facts. I'm great friends of Ken McLaughlin, the historian of the university, and just this past year when we were putting together the Building Waterloo Region exhibitions, 8 exhibitions about the history of architecture in Waterloo Region, my research assistant and I were poring over his 3 books of history of the university and looking for a piece of information that I knew was in the books somewhere, but I couldn't remember which book and where. And we're poring over these things, and at a certain point, we find the piece of information we're looking for, and he and I look up from the table, look at each other, and say the same thing. 3 books of history of the university and not one plan. How can you write the history of an institution and not have a plan? Like, not show what the physical development of the place is. Now, that's probably revealing that at some level, nobody wants to acknowledge that there are some issues around the physical development of the place. But when I talked to Ken about it, he said, okay, Rick, that's fine. I'm just not a visual guy. It's up to you. Well, I haven't done it yet, but I borrowed some things from the most recent master plan of the university to just hit home a couple of really simple concepts about the development of this campus. This map shows in yellow the 2 buildings that were here in 1960. And in red, all the buildings that were built between 1960 and 1969. It's staggering. It's just staggering. But you could do a similar exercise with Laurier. Remember, Conestoga College is being built at the same time. Remember that in 1958, there was only 1 high school in Kitchener-Waterloo. By 1972, there were 8. I mean, the amount of construction and the dedication and commitment to educational infrastructure in this period is almost unthinkable. and certainly unachievable in the present day. But it's just staggering. Most of the area inside the ring road and much of the area outside the ring road was developed. Between 1970 and 1979, you've got this very interesting pattern of buildings that appear at the periphery. You get the PAS building, you get Engineering 4, Applied Health Science, and then the Faculty Club, the University Club at the north end of the campus, and the UW apartments at the bottom, and et cetera. 80 to 89, what do you get? Fed Hall, Columbia Icefield. The building on the right wasn't built. I mean, that's the conversion of Waterloo manufacturing into dance and fine art, right, and such. And then the two buildings that matter to me are the one at the lower left, which you may euphemistically know as ES2, and the one in the middle, huge red pattern and form in the middle, which is this building right here. And it's really interesting how little was actually built in this period, and the construction actually drops further. As if I gave you the map from the 90s, there's virtually nothing on it. And then around 14 years ago, things start to pick up again, ramp up in a big way, and then you get the kind of atomic multiplicative growth of the engineering faculty and their et cetera, and away we go. But I just wanted to put the Davis Center in some kind of context here, because there's a huge slowdown in construction from the end of the 60s. It's slowing and slowing and slowing into the 80s and actually into the 90s. So this building is actually a sort of rare phenomenon. And for those of you who are around, the funding issues surrounding this building, I invoke them a little bit later, but the funding issues around this building were quite profound. The building was supposed to cost $20 million. Actually, to think of getting this building for $20 million today is just inconceivable. I mean, we live in the shadow of the quantum nano cash cow. But it didn't cost $20 million. The price ballooned, and of course, it meant that other construction projects had to be put on hold. Now, I'm going to look at this from the architectural perspective, and I'm going to just remind you that when Waterloo was first conceived, they actually hired a local firm named Jenkins and Wright to do the first building design. But quickly, and for reasons that I'm not clear on, they jettisoned Jenkins and Wright. Jenkins and Wright is best known for what was the C.N. Weber plant on Queen Street in Kitchener, very beautiful modernist building. And Waterloo went out and hired Shore and Moffett, which was a big old firm from Toronto, to do the master plan for the Waterloo campus and to design the buildings. And to be dead honest, virtually everything that you see in this aerial photograph from 1967 was designed by Shore and Moffett, with the exception of the under construction math and computer building, and of course, the affiliated colleges on the other side of the river, which were all actually designed by local architects. But otherwise, it's all Shore and Moffett. And when you talk to people who were working in the office at that time, they were just having a riot. They just thought, what shall we, at first there were very linear, straightforward buildings with creating these courtyards and such, but then they kind of get on the weed and design the engineering lecture hall and South Campus Hall, and like, what were they smoking with? This is the 60s. And then, well, and Shore and Moffett did the athletic complex too. But the university started to hire other architects. And so first off, you get a firm called Webb, Zarafa, Menkes, and Housden, which was best known for ruining the downtown cores of middle-sized cities from the east to the west coast of Canada, Halifax to Vancouver, tearing down existing building fabric and putting up crappy high-rise office towers. But we gave them the Math and Computer Building, and we gave them the two buildings in the southwest corner of the campus, the Humanities Building and PAS. And we decided to give prizes for the most bizarre staircase that you could possibly come up with. Now, in a more positive light, and I should say, being an architecture student, being on co-op, I have to admit that I actually spent a work term at Webb, Zarafa, Menkes, and Housden. But I didn't have anything to do with these buildings. The very, very talented Japanese-Canadian architect Raymond Moriyama, architect of the new Region Museum, is responsible for the design of the Health Sciences Building, the original Health Sciences Building, and the Minotahegi Residence, which are quite good buildings. I mean, the Health Science made a very bad ecological error in trying to put a widening of a creek immediately after a 90-degree turn in the course of that creek and created, in effect, an eternal mudflat. But Ray really wanted that reflecting pool in front of the building, and fine. And then one of the weirdest decisions was Engineering 4. They hired an engineering firm to design the building, and Giffords went out and hired some architects to help them design a building, and then they really tried hard to be like architects and do things that were totally irrational. Like those towers and gates at the big propylea entrance to the east end of the campus, and strange multi-story spaces inside. And then, of course, the idea that people shouldn't actually get natural light in classrooms, so we'll have corridors on the outside of the building, and which is hugely wasteful in terms of the public space, but they were doing it for why, I don't know. And then this curious decision, when the university decided to make a faculty club, they hired a very old Toronto firm known as Mathers and Haldenby. Mathers and Haldenby was a firm that was founded in the first decade of the last century by my grandfather, Eric Haldenby, has the same name as I do, and his partner, Sherlock Mathers. And they had been important architects in Canada, Toronto, since before the First World War. And then in a situation that's extremely rare, both the sons of Eric Haldenby and Sherlock Mathers became architects and took over the firm. So my father was Douglas Haldenby and Andrew Mathers. And they got the commission to design what was then called the Faculty Club. So here's the first, this is, and I should give credit where credit is due. A lot of these photographs come from the University of Waterloo archive, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them come from a repository of construction photos and images that's of unbelievable value. It's in Ball Construction. Ball Brothers became Ball Construction, and I've been given access to their archive, and it's an unbelievable, they've got stuff that's just extraordinary. So this is a Ball Construction shot documenting the construction of the faculty club at U of W, Mathers and Haldenby Architects, in 1969. So, why is it important? The faculty club is a kind of curious building, and amazingly well preserved. They only recently got rid of the original furniture. I thought that was incredible. And they still have the beautiful go-go bulbs and Fat Albert light fixtures from the 1960s. I don't know where you find them anymore, but they've got them. So look, this is why I'm here, and why everything else I'm going to talk about today happened, is because of the faculty club. So I'm in grade 13, going to high school in Toronto, nice high school on Bloor Street, University of Toronto Schools. And I know I want to be an architect. My father and my grandfather went to the University of Toronto. Why would I do anything but go to the University of Toronto? I go down for an interview at the University of Toronto, and at the time, in the late 1960s, the school is under the influence of a demagogic dictator named Peter Pragnell. And Peter had convinced the entire school that architecture as a profession was wrong and any professional organization of architects was evil. And guess whose father was the chair of the registration board, i.e. the professional licensure and disciplinary branch of the Ontario Association of Architects? Mine. I went in for an interview, and everybody there was set to meet the devil's spawn. There is no question. That's what they expected me to be. And I mean, like, the School of Architecture is still at Huron and College. I went to school at Huron and Bloor. I walked down Huron Street and walked into this nightmare where they were accusing me of everything short of incest, you know? And I thought, this place is cracked. They're nuts. And because I was the son of an architect, I was supposed to already know everything there was to know about architecture, and I didn't. So I left the interview saying, I wouldn't go to this place. I'd rather walk on hot knives than go to this place. This place is, where am I going to go to school? Well, fortunately, 2 universities in Ontario had opened architecture schools because the provincial government was convinced that the place was going to, that Ontario was going to continue to grow at the rate it had been growing in the 1960s. And what are we going to need? We're going to need a lot of architects. So they opened architecture schools at Carleton and Waterloo in 1967. Actually, Waterloo 67, Carleton 68. Well, I grew up in downtown Toronto. I went to school on Bloor Street. What the heck? I mean, Ottawa, maybe. I'd never even, well, I came to Waterloo when my high school basketball team played in the provincial finals, and I wasn't on it. I just came to drink and cheer. That's my only experience in Waterloo. And so one morning in 1969, I drove with my dad's partner, Andrew Mathers, who was in charge of this project, up. He was coming to a job meeting for the university, the faculty club, and I hitched a ride with him and went to Engineering 2 and met with the then director of the School of Architecture, Tor Bjornstad, and said, I'm here. Do you want me? And he said, yes. Carleton wouldn't take me because I hadn't taken all the maths in grade 13, so they wouldn't have me. So I came here. Like, that's it. I have no better reason for coming to Waterloo. Ken McLaughlin subsequently tells me that I'm the first member of the Toronto establishment to come to Waterloo. I was certainly the first graduate of the University of Toronto Schools to come to the University of Waterloo. Like, that's, but I couldn't give a crap. I'm here, you know? And so is the university club, you know? It worked out okay. You know, it doesn't really have a commanding form. Nobody knows what shape it is, unlike this building, and there is some exposed structure in it, timber. It's a nice building. One of 2 that Mathers and Haldenby designed on this campus. The other one, legally, is this one. Although, as I will recount over the next little while, Mathers and Haldenby really had very little to do with this except getting it built. And what happened to me? Well, of course, architecture left engineering in the summer of 1969, decamped and moved to a nondescript warehouse building on Phillip Street, and this is the view from the front door. Huh? I didn't know what to even think. I went to high school on Bloor Street. I grew up in Moore Park, and this is school. But I'll just say this, that it was the greatest thing I've ever done. And the people and the spirit and just being forgotten by the university. Like, I keep asking myself, how could the University of Waterloo ever have accepted the fact that the School of Architecture, which turns in very quickly to be the best school in the country, is housed in a place like this? I mean, this. But we were. And the spirit was amazing, utterly amazing. And being forgotten and left on our own and given no facilities worth thinking about was perfect. When the school decamped and went to Cambridge, the former dean of environmental studies came to me and said, you know, the reason your school is so good is because you suffered. I said, look, I'm not buying the starving artist theory here. We'll be fine. Well, you know, we lasted on Phillip Street until 1982, and then we moved into this stunning beauty, which was affectionately known as ES2. Now it's sprouted a much more aggressively modern top hat. But we lived in this building for 22 years. And it is while we were in this building that all of what I'm going to describe to you now took place. These are two of the protagonists of the story. You recognize on the right, Douglas T. Wright, president of the university, former dean of engineering, former deputy minister of almost everything in the provincial government. And the guy who preceded me as director of the School of Architecture, a man named Larry Wayne Richards, who came to us from Dalhousie. He grew up in the United States, came to Canada, and he was the director of the School of Architecture from 1982 to 1988. Larry and Doug got along like a house on fire. Larry liked Doug, Doug liked Larry. Doug considered himself a bit of an artist and certainly an engineer who had deep affection for aesthetics and for architecture. And Larry convinced Doug that the quality of the buildings that we were building on this campus was not very good. But, of course, the giant run of construction was pretty well over. And so which in a certain sense probably facilitated what happened here. That they weren't just pushing out buildings one after another, get an architect, get the building, get it built, get the next one underway. But there was going to be one building. And this building was going to be the result of a competition, a design competition. And this way we were going to get a wonderful building, better than anything else that had ever been built on campus. So Larry convinced Doug, and Doug got the rest of the university on side with this idea that this new computer research building was going to be designed by somebody excellent. And the building was going to be excellent. It was going to be forward-looking. It was going to be imaginative. We were going to set behind us this sort of red brick mundanity of most of the other architecture on campus, or the kind of expressionist flourishes of some of the WZMH buildings. We're going to get a really great modern building. And it was going to come through a competition route. Now, the way it worked was they invited expressions of interest. A committee was struck to select the architects. They invited expressions of interest. Some 40 firms submitted expressions. And the committee selected 6 to do designs for this building. And I'm sure that many of you never saw any of the other designs. So my first true revelation for today is to show you the drawings of what could have been here. Not all of them, because we'd be here all night, but let's just start with the worst. This is Giffels, the people who brought you Engineering 4. And they did a kind of rubber stamp solution with 3 similar shapes going back on a kind of weird diagonal with no obvious relationship to anything but a wonderful anticipation of a curvy bridge decades before we actually built one. So this is Giffels' entry. I mean, I show you only a site plan, but it would only make you sicker if I showed you any other drawings of this building, because it was horrible. This is Clifford, Laurie, Bolton, Ritchie, who are actually pretty good architects, and it's interesting what they end up doing. They create an L-shaped building, thicker on the east-west axis, thinner on the north-south, with a big courtyard with a kind of theatrical space at the east end and a huge passage facing onto the ring road. And the building is actually quite close. It's closer to the ring road in general. I mean, as you know, the ring road veers over, and so you get wider at the south end than the north. There's a big atrium in the center, so not unlike what you've got, but none of these sort of secondary multi-story skylit passages that. Now, this is really interesting. This is Nish, Owen, Roland, and Roy, Knorr architects from Toronto. And they too have this L-shaped building, this giant ziggurat opposite the Math and Computer building. These are the 2 lecture halls, the 2 big lecture halls. This kind of monumentalization of the lecture halls. And then they have this kind of stepped down architecture. And what is at the bottom of those steps, which actually anticipates a bit the new science building over there. But that space at the bottom is a huge pool, like a lake in the middle of the courtyard. And again, a kind of metabolist architecture with big circulation spaces going off in an L shape. Really, it's actually an interesting, but this one is a fantastic thing. Actually, I apologize. I apologize. The last one is Shore Tilby, the successor firm of Shore and Moffat. This is Knorr. This is Nish, Owen, Roland, and Roy. And they've taken the industrial skylight to a monumental dimension. The entire building is covered with sawtooth skylights. And they're not small. They're not, no industrial building in Waterloo region has sawtooth skylights this big. I mean, our building in Cambridge has sawtooth skylights, but these things are colossal. To think, I mean, my own estimate of the cost of this building is double what the budget was. I mean, in the end, this building cost 50% more than the budget. But that building would have been double, for sure. Like, you can't build this thing. I don't know what they were smoking. And look at this kind of surreal courtyard over here. This, again, it's kind of a little gazebo and then a volcano in the center for sacrificing failed students. I just don't know what to say about this thing. And then the courtyard between the building and Math and Computer, anyone who was alive and knows anything about architecture in the 1980s knows that form, the curved form facing, we called it the piano curve. It was known as the form of the year. Almost every building wanted one. And then this sort of strange tartan grid of what? Like, what is that in the courtyard? We don't know. But, you know, this is the image. And here's this. Like the whole idea of this thing is so that you cannot understand what the form of the building is. I once sat in a crit with a very good architect looking at a student project that had one of these. And the architect looked at the student and said, "How could you make your pencil do that?" Now, the curious thing that happened in this competition was supposed to be a one-stage competition. They get the 6 projects. They pick one. What happened was that the committee couldn't decide. There were 2 projects that got a certain amount of favor. One was the project that eventually got built, and the other is this project by Eberhard Zeidler, the architect of the Eaton Centre in Toronto, the McMaster Health Sciences Centre at Mac. And I mean, Eb Zeidler is one of the most successful architects ever in Canada. He was my very first employer. I worked for Craig Zeidler and Strong when I was my 1A work term. I thought he was God. Well, this site plan is not particularly clear. We know that there's a big courtyard. And trivia, Chemistry 2 was designed by Craig Zeidler and Strong. And the co-op student on his 1A work term was given the job of designing the super graphics, the abstract patterns that were painted on the block walls. So if any of you remember those sunburst patterns from in there that have now been painted over, I did those. That was my very first professional work. So they've got this giant sort of hockey rink looking courtyard and another sort of oval thing, turnaround, porte cochere thing out in front. And then 2 wings of buildings, and the wings are divided into smaller buildings by courtyards. It's not a very compelling looking drawing, but it was a very interesting alternative to all the other ones, which were these kind of mega structural, continuous, extruded buildings. And Zeidler's building is a whole lot of little pavilions, really, with courtyards and trees in between them, a much more genteel and gentle kind of architecture. It looks like a 1980s kind of postmodernist building. It had a continuous facade on the courtyard, then on the big courtyard, and then the little courtyards inside were glazed over so that they were protected. But it was like, I mean, its progenitor is actually Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia with a kind of walkway connecting a series of academic pavilions, and that was what this building consisted of. So, and this is the most compelling drawing in the whole set, which is this sort of fairy tale vision of the central rotunda looking into this Baroque courtyard, the backdrop of which is the Math and Computer Building. It's a fantastic drawing, just a fantastic drawing. So anyway, the jury picks these 2 schemes, this one and that one, and says to the architects, so the original schemes were submitted at the end of April. The judging went on for a couple of months, and then early in the summer, they tell both architects, you need to do new schemes. We need changes in both of your schemes, and the final competition will be between just you 2. Now, I get the sense from talking to Eb Zeidler that his view of this was, a deal's a deal. We did a scheme. You paid us almost nothing. We're not working anymore on this. So when the final schemes came in at the end of August, the Zeidler scheme was basically unchanged. No additional work had been, a model had been built. And the pavilions became a bit more articulated. I cannot find in the university archives any images of the final Zeidler scheme, and Zeidler's office couldn't find them either. So I can't show you exactly what the final scheme. I'm only going by my own memory, and I followed this quite closely. They articulated the pavilions to make them appear more separate, and they made it look way more bricky. Just more brown bricky, like what they thought the rest of the campus was about. On the other side of this final competition, well, and from in the first competition as well, was the project by Mathers and Haldenby and IKOY. IKOY Architects from Winnipeg. IKOY, the K in IKOY stands for Keenberg, and the K should be at a completely different scale than the other three letters because the ego behind the K dwarfs any of the other three figures whose initials are there. But what's really interesting to me, and I've had some testimony in preparing for this today, I went and talked to some of these kids, is that it's actually sort of my fault that this happened. And the reason I say that is that Ron Keenberg was invited to come and speak at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. And he's got a big booming voice and an even bigger booming ego and a lot of talent. And he influenced a lot of students and seduced a lot of students. And so he actually attracted, the green names here are students who were in the graduating class in the year that this building was designed. And he basically made off with a sixth of our graduating class to work on this competition. If you look at the team, and he's even left out a name here, and I'm not sure why. But the ones in green were students in the architecture school. Dave Driscoll was a graduate. The only person from his office in Winnipeg was this Magda person, and Andrea Christoph was a friend of Larry Richards from Toronto. So that was the design team. Their statement for the building, it's a Keenberg statement. I'm going to make a building that is the embodiment of an idea of architecture in which architecture is defined by its purpose and its elements. And he had these 5 elements that he liked to talk about: the structure, the mechanical, the electric, the parts of architecture. Structure, mechanical, electrical, skin, and what he called fitments. And you can actually, in the end of the day, when you walk around this building, it's perfectly clear that his elemental thinking about architecture did follow right through into the building. You can see the elements of structure, skin, electrical, mechanical, and fitments. You trip over the soda fountain fitments. He had very clear ideas about what architecture should be and how it would go together and how it would serve the purpose for which it was intended. Well, this is him. The picture he manipulated, not me. It's from his book, and I don't really need to say anything else except show you the title of his book. Really, Sex, Violence, and Architecture. Here it is. Volume 1, there has not been a Volume 2, I hasten to add. And the sex and violence part, I can't find.
When you held up the book, it was impossible to see the word sex.
Yeah.
Is that intentional?
I would assume so. Because it's actually, there is no sex in the book, unless you find this sexy. The other thing that's really intriguing about it is the quality of the reproductions is not, they're huge. You know, everything is a double-page spread. But they're not very good. You know, like, they're low quality, and it's very interesting to me. Ron won't answer questions. Ron is still alive, let's just say. He's actually, today, he's in New Zealand. Because I'll talk about this. So I asked a couple of people who were involved in the project to do some recollections that I could share with you today. So this is one of the students. Ron Keenberg of IKOY Architects taught a workshop to fourth-year students at Waterloo in the winter term of '83. After giving a lecture on the work of his firm to the entire school, he asked some of the students to work on the competition, that is the Davis Center competition. If memory serves, the recent graduates who worked on the competition were. And what's interesting is the name Douglas Birkinshaw is left off the list that Ron Keenberg included, but Douglas was there. And in fact, I'm going to show you some drawings that Douglas did, and I've been talking to him. So he basically abducted a sixth of our graduating class to work on the project. I'm not 100%, so maybe Douglas could confirm. Andrew Mathers and Douglas Haldenby were involved. I can't remember who worked on the design during the competition from MHA, Mathers and Haldenby Architects. Jonathan Stools, who wrote this, was working full-time at another architectural firm. He actually tells a great story that he arrived 20 minutes late from his other job one night. It got there at 6 o'clock instead of 5:30, and Ron yelled at him. He's working 2 jobs. Ron was a difficult man. I'll show you a little bit about the 2 firms, but the bottom line is Mathers and Haldenby is a very conservative firm. And when Ron came in and started throwing his weight around and using sailor-like language, my father went to him and just said, "We don't talk like that here. If you speak to one more person that way, this competition is over." Because there was a problem. Ron Keenberg wasn't an architect. If you could get through this book, you realize that he admits that he was actually studying medicine and left medicine to study design. He went to the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, but he studied interior design. He came back to Winnipeg, joined up with a bunch of architects, formed an architectural firm, which would have been illegal in Ontario because at that time you had to, anyone who was named in the firm had to be an architect, a licensed architect. In Manitoba, you didn't, so that was okay. But when he came to practice architecture in Ontario, he was violating the law. Mathers and Haldenby was the most respectable architectural firm in Ontario. They never had a discipline problem with the Ontario Association of Architects. Well, hell, they shouldn't. My father was the chair of the disciplinary body. Somebody complained that Mathers and Haldenby had allowed an unlicensed architect to practice in Ontario. Ron Keenberg. Ron Keenberg. Well, let me just add one footnote to this story, and I won't come back to it. After this building was built, after Ron had moved on, he continued to do some teaching at Waterloo. Larry Richards steps down in 1987, December 31st, 1987. I became the director January 1st, 1988. In the first year of my directorship, Ron Keenberg came to me and said, "I want you to give me a degree. And I want to get a degree for writing this book." And I said, "Well, look, Ron, at that time, to get a degree in architecture, you actually had to design something." And so, no, I won't give you a degree for writing the book. You'd have to register as a student and do a project the same way everyone else does. And then but you wouldn't be able to start in 5th year. I mean, you have an interior design degree. You can't start in 5th year. So Ron went ballistic. He went to Doug Wright. Doug Wright called me and said, why aren't you going along with this? I'm saying, because my colleagues would fire me. My students would completely lose respect for me. I'm not doing it. So I'm not mentioned in this book, thankfully. Most of my colleagues are, and many of the students. Ron went to the University of Manitoba, and do you know what they did? They said yes. And do you know what happened? The dean and the director both had to resign after he got his degree. And it was obvious that the design that was submitted for his degree was actually done by people in his office. So there you are. I do like the last paragraph here. After going on in the second phase, celebration was held in a Greek restaurant across Yonge Street. After Rizzino and Uzo, I remember Andrew Mathers dancing and tossing plates on the floor. This is the IKOY office in Winnipeg. And if you want to know why this building looks like the way it does, just look at where they work. This is their office. Ron and his partners made a huge amount of money early in their careers building cheap high-rise apartment, designing cheap high-rise apartment buildings for developers in Winnipeg. And then they had a road to Damascus conversion. Ron fell off his horse, saw the light, and decided to use their ill-gotten gains to pursue a new vision of architecture, which was rooted in modern technology, in the completely literal and straightforward expression of the techniques involved with building contemporary buildings. So that's what their office looks like. This is their building at the University of Manitoba. You've got the corrugated siding with the moldings. You've got the big glazed walls. You've got the exposed mechanical systems. And of course, most obviously, you can't see it in this image, but the hollow core flooring, the floor that integrates the mechanical and electrical. And then you've got these big highs. Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's Manitoba. That's the University of Manitoba.
That looks really familiar.
So let me quickly say, that's IKOY. The only reason Mathers and Haldenby got involved in this project is because some of the students that had gone with Ron had done co-op work terms at Mathers and Haldenby and decided that the best way that Ron could win this competition, because he couldn't practice in Ontario, would be to ally himself with a well-established firm in Ontario. So Ron, through the students, connected with M&H, which made it legal. Actually not, but at the time, they thought legal. So this is my father on the right and my grandfather on the left. This firm was the oldest architectural firm in Canada, the only one that had fully gone through 2 generations until the 3rd generation decided not to practice and stayed in the academe. So they do beautiful buildings. This is the University Club in Toronto. My grandfather designed it in the 1930s. It's a lovely building based on the Boodles Club in London, but actually a nicer building than the one in London. I'm very proud of it. This is a very controversial Mathers and Haldenby building, Toronto City Hall. This was the M&H, they were the architects for Toronto City Hall. They proposed this, and people said, no, this is a modern city. We don't want a limestone sort of abstract classical slab. So, and the School of Architecture primarily led the revolt, and so this building is the building that provoked Toronto to hold an international design competition and get Villiers Ravel to design the wings and the flying saucer. And thank goodness. I mean, but fortunately, Imperial Oil needed a new headquarters, so they just took the drawings from the City Hall, moved them a couple of blocks north onto St. Clair Avenue, and built a more modern-looking building, the headquarters for Imperial Oil, which, as you may know, was recently being converted into staggeringly expensive condos. So this is, you know, you can imagine what the marriage of these two firms was like. Like, there are no more incompatible types than these. So this was the Mathers and Haldenby office building on St. Mary and Yonge Street, just south of Bloor and Yonge in Toronto. It's actually under threat of demolition. The Toronto Historical Board is trying to save it. So the condo developer is now going to try to build a building through this building for a 41-story condo tower on top of this. You know, like, where are we? This was, it happened to be the first building in Canada that had the Venetian blinds inside the windows. There's a whole lot of innovative features that Ron would have loved, but he didn't like them, and they didn't like him. This is John's assessment of Ron's approach. He divided architecture into elements: structure, envelope, mechanical systems, electrical systems, and fitments. He treated teaching as a workshop of ideas, very real to the students, and also as a way of trying to attract people to work with him. During his workshops at the school, I remember James MacDonald telling Ron that an important element was missing: feeling. Ron took that criticism of his work seriously and developed a new design element in his lexicon called cultural content. In design, the elements were layered and exposed. They were color-coded. I mean, not that the code necessarily makes any sense. It might have made sense to Ron. I'm not here to decode it for you because I can't. But colors were on his mind constantly, and you only have to be in this building for a few minutes to know that. Each system was assigned an elemental colors. So, you know, the fact that the washrooms share colors is just part of the system. And clearly separate in the architecture. I always thought the vision in terms of Argyle socks, where the yarns are parallel, offset, and distinct. I mean, I think John's said, Ron was quoted as saying he thought it looked like the inside of a computer full of colored wire. Well, what computer is full of colored wire anymore? Not, you know, not that much. But I like John's idea. It's more like an Argyle sock. It's a kind of tartan pattern that goes. It's also including a strong idea about construction. The more that would be fabricated in the factory, the greater control of the quality and schedule. Repeatability was important, so the components can be produced in jigs on a shop and clipped in place. It was an elegant aesthetic approach, and it has served me well in my career. John is now the principal at Diamond Schmidt Architects. He's an incredibly talented young man. And these are just interesting from a sketchbook of one of the students who worked on the project, Doug Birkinshaw, where you can actually see in the first one, they're looking at the site with Chem 2 and math and computer, and they see this axis going through, because they believed that this was going to be the east gateway of the campus, even if at the time there was very little evidence that that was the case. Like, what was there over there in the early 1980s? Nothing. It's very interesting to see what's happened. So this is the original sketch, and there's a couple of just really interesting things. I like the one at the top, 15,000 square feet of offices with no direct light. So they knew that, like, this is right at the beginning. They knew that they had a crisis when you design a building that's just this big rectangular block. But the aesthetic obviously was already there. I mean, it had already been built at Manitoba, so they knew pretty much what the building was going to be. And then on the inside, the haunched columns. Now, I don't know how many of you know this. Probably most of you already do. But originally, the idea was that all of the structure in this building would be precast in a factory where you can control the quality. So, you know, the notion is you walk into this building and it looks like it's all an assemblage of parts. The problem was that the concrete industry in Ontario at the time was precasting only bridge beams and cladding for office towers. To get someone to set up, to precast the columns and ribs, vault ribs in this building was prohibitively expensive. It would have cost a fortune. So all of those columns that look like pieces that have just been assembled as a constructo set with the haunches so you can just lay the beams on it, complete lie. Every one of those columns was formed and cast in place. Every one of them, right? So the image of the building, Ron and his whole thing about truth in construction, blah, 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 lie. Didn't happen. It looks like it did, but if you look at them, you can see they've cast them, and the joints are not where they should be. The joints are halfway up the shaft. It's hilarious. It's actually hilarious. But here they are, and just look, these are the first sketches, and you know, curved walls, the iconic spaces in the center, they knew what they were doing, and then the haunched columns, which were all, you know, supposed to be, these were the joints, right? No. So here's the plan. This is I mean, I'm sorry, this is a beautiful watercolor, but the material in the university archives is all black and white, and it's all from microfilm. Like it's very hard to get at. But this is a Howard Sutcliffe watercolor, and you can see what the original plan was. The EMS library is on the top of the drawing here. North is down in this case. This was going to be the dining hall, the two big lecture rooms, and then the center element, which is basically the same, and no long wing, no northern wing. There is a parking lot here, and then some kind of courtyard, and then this boulevard that goes off to infinity. Like, I don't know where they thought that was going to end. I mean, Phillip Street, I guess. I don't know. But they had this premonition about the east part of the campus. So here it is. This was the Keenberg, Mathers, and Haldenby submission. You can see dining hall, ICR in the center, and the library flanked with the lecture rooms, and a big atrium and two vaulted corridors that go up through a couple of levels. What I really like about this is, of course, it shows how many of the offices wouldn't have had light in this scheme. Like, more than half the offices wouldn't have had light. Now, in studying the other schemes, the Keenberg, the only scheme where every office had light was the Zeidler scheme, because they put all those courtyards in. So that, if I reconstruct the thinking of the jury, I have to think they're looking at the Keenberg scheme and they like the compactness of it and they like the spirit of it, but then they look at these massive areas where the offices don't have windows, and then they look at a much more traditional and sort of gentle scheme by Zeidler and say, well, you know, they couldn't decide. So they send them both back to work. But these are all part of the original competition submission, and the section is the section. I mean, you know, you live in this building, you know it. And this is the atrium. The only real difference in the atrium is that the atrium in this project is, in a way, livelier than the actual atrium because of the location of a big stair in the main space. I mean, coming from the School of Architecture, we have a big stair in our main atrium, and it's a huge animator of the space. But that disappears. And then here is the view of it from the ring road, and that elevation of it really didn't change at all between the first and the second scheme. For those of you who are hugely interested in the office design, I mean, Ron was really preoccupied with the fitments and designing the offices properly. And it frustrated him immensely that people didn't appreciate all the work he was doing and put their only concern seemed to be that they had natural light in a window. And it drove him crazy because he didn't really care about those kinds of things. And he put huge amounts of effort into developing the prototypes for the offices. Two problems. One, the budget got tight. I mean, not got tight, they went way over budget. So the money, and you know what happens in a construction project, those pieces of the project that come last get cut. So what always gets cut? Furnishings and landscaping. What got cut in this building? Furnishings and landscaping. Absolutely. Like, I'll show you what the plan for this courtyard was. Not the wasteland that's been out there for 30 years. Absolutely not. And the offices were supposed to be really well equipped, really well dimensioned, very ergonomically designed. Of course, in the last instance, they wanted to squeeze in more offices, so even the project at the second stage, which took a lot of the offices out of the center of the main block here and put them on the long wing so more of them would get light, still they wanted more offices with windows. And so that's why, in many cases, the offices don't line up with the mullions in the glass, because they actually changed the dimensions of the offices and made them narrower after they'd ordered the windows. So the window mullions were ordered, couldn't be changed. The office partitions were changed, and that's just why it happened. And if you think that this is the only building in the world where that has happened, you would be dead wrong, because it happens all the time, unfortunately. So there it is. That was the image that won the day in the competition. And here's the final, this is the second stage proposal, where you can see they put well, as you know, they put the dining hall at the end of the north wing. They thinned out this side of the building. And the space where we are now is obviously changed from the plan that won the competition. EMS, the two lecture halls. It's interesting, each of the lecture halls was associated, they were supposed to actually have, the end walls were supposed to, you were supposed to be able to raise them, and so that you could have lectures in the center in the summertime, because Ron was really excited about the fact that this place operated in the summer, and so that you could have sort of indoor-outdoor lecture halls. Obviously, the amphitheatrical pieces on the outside got cut with everything else in the landscaping plan, so they didn't happen. And just to look at the details, so you've got the terrace in the front, the passage through the building, and then this courtyard, which had pavement, it had trees, it had grass areas, it had fountains. You know, it was supposed to be a deliberate piece of landscape, but again, we have typically on this campus and in many, many projects not spent any money on landscaping. It's gone by the time you get to landscaping, and there's no money left. These are just, you know, so you know how they won the competition. This is the courtyard. Looks nice. So these are the second floors. This is the upper floor. You can see he just rips at least a third of the offices out of the cores of this part of the building and stretches them out along the north side so everybody gets windows. Well, this is the local press. First, the building was late. Second, cost too much. Expensive building. Well, I mean, you look at this today and say, what, $27 million? What does $27 million build you? But yeah, the budget was supposed to be $21 million. They overspent by $6 million. They had to delay the Columbia Lake Townhouse project, if you remember that. That's got set back a year because of the overspending in this building. And you know, that's the way it goes. But when it was opened, the architectural press loved it. They just went wild about it. This is Adele Friedman, the then architecture writer in the Globe and Mail. Bold, brash, and brilliant, and believe it or not, it's a building. Really, this is criticism. While Toronto hasn't had much to cheer about in the way of architecture lately, the city of Waterloo can celebrate a winner. It's the William G. Davis Computer Research Center on the University of Waterloo, which opens officially next Thursday. $27 million graduate facility was designed by IKOY, Winnipeg firm with Mason Haldenby. Not only does it rank as one of the most exciting buildings to appear on the parched Canadian landscape in years, but it also represents a personal triumph for IKOY's resident philosopher and chief designer, Ron Keenberg. Canadian Architect ran the longest review of any building ever in the history of the magazine. There are 7 pages of images and then a 5-page critical appreciation of the building in its October 1988 edition. The critique was written by one Val Rinomary, currently a professor of architecture at the University of Waterloo. Canadian Architect cannot publish critical reviews because the way they finance their magazine is that they go to suppliers who've put products into the buildings they publish and ask the suppliers to buy ads in the magazine. So, for example, when my colleague Don Mackay wrote a critical review of the original Perimeter Institute building, they refused to publish it because none of the suppliers to the building would advertise if the critique was negative. So, you know, in case you think that this is a serious critical journal, think again. This is Ron's, and they published this verbatim. He added from his original 5 components of architecture, structure, mechanical, electrical, skin, and fitments. He takes out fitments here and puts planning in. And the reason I think this is because he started hanging out with these Waterloo students who said, you know, you can't design a building as if there's no buildings around it. You can't design a building that has no respect for the location and no consideration of its context. Ron referred to what they were saying as that context shit. But then he actually responds to it. I mean, these are the pictures that Canadian Architect published. I mean, they're fetching. And as it was remarked coming in, visitors to this building generally like it. The people who don't like it are the people who have to work in it. But I got to tell you, that's not uncommon. And we also have to say, I didn't put up Kish Han's article that asserts that the building has sick building syndrome. Actually, when I read it, I thought, well, Kish, if you came over to ES2, you'd find exactly the same problems. You know, the way plant ops handles the humidity in the air, the way, I mean, it's just, mechanical systems are very hard to deal with, but this, and Ron's preoccupation with the directness of things and experience, you know, did lead him to some absurdities. You know, walking in through a single door from a Canadian winter into this atrium is an absurdity. Having no shelter over the entrances was an absurdity. I mean, there's directness and there's just abuse. And he just didn't like these kinds of things. But I do want to say that, you know, this building does represent a major departure in terms of the University of Waterloo. I mean, the scale of the building is very different, and you know, the biggest building before it is Math and Computer is a precise object, sits in the middle. I mean, this building is long, narrow. It is the biggest footprint of any building on campus up to the time, and it starts as a rectangular block, but then it, you know, Ron modifies it. He throws out that north wing. He starts to make courtyards. He makes space on the ring road side. You know, he did learn something in doing the building. And the other thing that I do have to say, and I'm currently writing a book about industrial architecture, especially industrial architecture in this region. And we have a stock of industrial architecture that is really second to none. Toronto, there's some more monumental industrial buildings that have been preserved. But I mean, I come back to this building, Dominion Tire on Strange Street, which is designed by the greatest industrial architect who ever lived, Albert Kahn, architect, Detroit, Michigan, Walkerville, Ontario. He's actually an OAA member, which is, the OAA didn't even know it. I found out. And, you know, you can feel what the weight of this industrial architecture is and why this kind of building was so inspirational to modern architects. I mean, this building is built in 1912. It's before the First World War. The reason these industrial buildings are the way they are, of course, with all the big glazing, with narrow floor plates, et cetera, is because they needed to be naturally lit. Because before electric light is an efficient and well, or even possible for illuminating these industrial buildings, you know, you needed natural light. Hence the big windows, hence the narrow floor plates, hence the tall multi-story buildings. As soon as you could light these spaces artificially, effectively, boom, industrial buildings go to one floor, spread to infinity. But this is the image of an industrial building that the great modern architects Walter Gropius and Corbusier loved. And it is also worth pointing out that Albert Kahn is the one who rationalizes architecture. I mean, he rationalizes the production of architecture. He sets up the first modern architectural office with differentiated tasks and proper project scheduling. And he starts to look at buildings elementally the way, and Ron was just really reassimilation, reasserting a Kahnian approach to design in the face of the modernists around him, and then, of course, in the face of the postmodernists who'd started just grabbing historical pastiche and gluing classical pieces and putting temple fronts wherever, and Ron hated that. This is what he loved, and I will say that this is such a strong tradition in our architecture in the region. Like, what is Waterloo region architecture? Really, it's industrial. That's what it is. And somehow it's also in the spirit of this university. I believe that strongly. And so whatever one says, you know, architecture is architecture. It's an aesthetic statement unless it has no aesthetic ambition. And we've got some buildings that have no aesthetic ambition, but this isn't one of them. I mean, whatever else this is, it's somebody trying to say, this is what architecture is. And it's aggressive, as Adele Friedman says. My colleague Rinomary writes the following, which I think is interesting. It's also possible that with its ductwork resembling the movie set for Brazil, the building could intimidate gentler souls with the overt truth of the ruthless rigor of its making. Technology needs a certain authority and organization to exist as a system of freedoms, and the IKOY building makes this truth very evident. And so, like modernist projects of the latter half of this century, it has a cold, austere aspect. Its building fabric, or matrix, and Ron described buildings as matrices, and you don't have to be in this building long to know that he did. It's homogeneous and relentless at all scales. The building's uniformity of tone can swallow the sunny optimism usually associated with computer people. I don't know how he knows that. I've never met an optimistic computer person. Like, what a pronouncement. I hope that makes you happy. Nothing is left undesigned. That it adopts a user-friendly openness in its architectural expression is an ironic positive feature. Architecture based on clever manipulation of building elements by IKOY could, as in the historic degeneration of modernist work, become its own self-referential cliche. Well, I mean, when you get buildings done this way, if they're drawn right, they look like what they look like when you build them. And all these drawings were done by kids who just graduated from the University of Waterloo School of Architecture, and they drew like angels. Now we have computers, thank you. Well, these are the ends. his sixth category was fitments. And Ron was a kind of a perverse soul. And so he took great delight in jokes, architectural jokes. So he foisted on all of you these soda fountain stools because, A, he didn't want furniture that you could move. He wanted it to be fixed, he wanted it to look like an industrial product, and he wanted it to feel like an industrial product. Like you, as a person, were an extension of the product. The chair accommodates. The stool you sit on and try to balance. And Ron saw people that way. You know, he wanted people to be organized in that geometrical pattern, sitting on the stools, and he knew what he was doing. He absolutely knew what he was doing. The next thing, of course, is the fake marble cladding on the front of this area. And he told me, this is a big joke. You know, it's a university. They'd really love marble and stone and brick, and I'm just going to give them Formica. I'm going to give them a kitchen counter. And that, you know, if they want marble, you got marble. And that's all it is. That's all it is. And then the Naga, I mean, he just loved the idea of these big fake leather chairs in the ICR lounge. He loved it. You know, they're not leather. They're plastic. That's what they are. And it's the same spirit that brought you, these are the fitments. I mean, he wanted people to have the most perfect offices. And when it turned out that people were more interested in window than the furnishings of their offices, at least in his mind, then he said, well, too bad. You know, you're going to get what you get. Now, there are other problems with the building. As you know, the truck siding that he used on the outside isn't really truck siding. It's supposed to be, but it isn't really. Again, they had to manufacture it. But it's not holding up all that well. The biggest problem, as you all know, is with the double glazed windows that are, you know, it's 30-year-old technology, and the vinyl seals are giving out. So you know, there's moisture getting in between the glass, and in some of the windows, there's actually pools of water at the bottom of the window. There is no solution to this, as my colleague John Straub, the building scientist, says, there is no solution to this. When you do all glass facades, especially in this technology, after 30 years, the only solution is to replace it all. And that's going to cost a huge fortune. Well, and I'm a great fan of Joseph Rickford, much more than I am of Ron Keenberg. So when Joseph Rickford says that irony is the only position not open to the architect, I actually am on Joseph's side. And I think that to treat the fitments of a building the way Ron did, I mean, I'm good for a joke. I actually wanted to donate a prize for perversity in the School of Architecture, the Haldenby Perversity Prize. But, you know, these things are not deep. They're not deep. That's just the simple fact. Well, here they are. Doug, Bill, and our David opening the building in 1988. I was here. I was in the atrium when they did this. And I admire smooth politicians, and Bill Davis was about the smoothest. And I always thought David Peterson would never match up, and he didn't that day. Bill's speech was pure art. David was a bit halting. He lost. So does anyone know what this is? Does anyone know what this actually is? I mean, I came over here because somebody told me that there was a plaque. And I said, nah, there's no plaque. And there is a plaque for the wooden clock. But there's no plaque for this. And every time I ask a student, do you know what that is? No, I don't know what that is. What is that? What is that thing? hanging up there. Well, okay. I'm going to tell you what it is. And I'm going to tell you who made it. And all I can do, what I can't tell you is why it's there. Ron decided to have it hang there. It's all Ron's idea. His buddy, Donald Mackay, who's still a professor in the architecture school, made this project. It's called Going Zero, a freestanding awning that was to be one of 24 spaced in an even grid in Harbourfront Park located along the shoreline of Toronto Harbour. Each wing was stretched with fabric which screens out the burning rays of the sun. The park laid out with a slope of grass for sunbathing, a swimming pool, sounds nice. A solar heated hot pool was to become the center for lakeside sunbathing. This is, 25 years before Sugar Beach. Prepared as an entry in an open competition exhibit as part of citywide exhibit, the interpretation of architecture, this project was designed to expose certain aspects of meteorological environment of Toronto Harbour while proposing a lighter, freer form of architecture and a hedonistic approach to programs for public life. So the next time someone asks you what the hell that thing is hanging up there, now you can tell them. It is a rhetorical device that advocates for a hedonistic approach to the programs of public life. The artist's name is Donald Mackay. He and Ron were really great buddies. They liked drinking port together. And Donald helped them with the design of this building. And Ron liked the object, and it was hoisted up there. And it's been hanging there ever since the building opened. And there is still no plaque to say. But by this time, I think that's fine. Who cares? Now, there is a little postscript to this story. This is a project that was done by one of my grad students, and he got about 800 or 900 University of Waterloo students to tether their cell phones into a GPS system so he could track their movements around the campus. This is about 3 years ago. And what it shows is pretty obvious, that the real center of the Waterloo campus is here. And if you think that's the case now, and look at all the people who are coming from the east. These are people who might be in a car or something coming in. There's hardly anyone coming in from the north, of course, but they're all coming in from the east, and they're all coming in through parking lots. What a great university we have. Why do our alumni love us so much? Because we make them spend their entire student careers entering the campus by walking beside dumpsters. This is incredible. Incredible. But this is the nexus of the whole campus. The next thing that's going to happen, of course, is across the street, they're opening the only LRT stop on campus that anyone will get off at, because the one on the North Campus is in a cornfield. What? Who's going to get off there? They're all going to get off right here. Now, we have been told that the buses are no longer going to go around the ring road. They're going to go onto a driveway in the parking lot on the East Campus. So all the people getting off the buses, all the people getting off the LRT, they're all going to come right through this building. This is the center of the campus. And the east side of the ring road is the new principal axis, because all the buildings are going up. I mean, they pretty well, there are almost no more spaces to shoehorn in buildings on the inside the ring road. And we still, of course, don't have a plan for the ring road. We don't actually have a plan for any of it. But we're doing it. So I just, when I came to give this talk today, I thought, unbelievable, it really is extraordinary. That boulevard thing that was in the Keenberg scheme right from the beginning is a vision. It's a vision. It's right. Because that's where people come from. They don't come in the north and south entrance. They come in the east side. They come right through this building, or either just north of it or just south of it. And it would be a great thing to reconsider before it's too late what this axis of the east side of the ring road looks like and what the transverse axis that goes through this building is. So we did. Down at the School of Architecture, that's what we did. we decided to look. Now, we recommended that they not take the buses off the ring road. You can take the cars off the ring road, but keep the buses on the ring road because it's actually the most efficient way of getting people around to the different places on campus. Rather than having them all dropped off in a bus parking lot just north of B there, and having them walk across the LRT tracks, walk across the ring road, and come into the campus from that side, all of them, it would really make much more sense to leave the buses on the ring road and to have these points of arrival distributed around. But the main point of arrival, the main transit terminus, is this building and right in front of this building. But that's not what we're going to do. I don't know why. So this is just, it's the same Donald Mackay that did the going zero in the atrium that supervised this project. And I will say that the university paid for it. Like, they paid good money to have Donald work with a group of graduate students and develop this plan. But we paid good money for people to develop brands. We've paid good money for people to do all kinds of things, and then sweep it up, set it on fire. I mean, this was an image of a kind of canopied garden transit space on the east face of this building, across from the LRT stop where the GO buses would come. And you've seen what this place looks like at certain times of day and night today, since they put the transit pass in. I had a son who was a student in computing science, and he would call some nights and say, well, I can't get a bus. The bus is full. I've got to wait for another bus. This building is really designed to accommodate and welcome its role as a sort of threshold to the campus. It was that way, and if you read that original text that Keenberg wrote from the original competition, he talks about it as the gateway, the east gateway to the campus. That's why it is the way it is. It's just not going to happen exactly that way. So I apologize for having been long-winded. I hope it's been at least a little amusing and maybe informative in some way. I'm not doing a technical analysis of the building. I'm not going to tell you how to solve its building science problems or how the air could be better. Those are mysteries that are left to mechanical engineers, except that apparently nobody in mechanical engineering studies heating, ventilating, and air conditioning anymore. So it's no wonder that it never works. Thank you for your patience. Thank you. Anyone got a really pressing, Vic?
So I remember Ron Keenberg pulling out his little German lead holder and drawing something and saying, this building I'm creating will, when you leave your office, you'll run into everyone else that you need to see. Could you comment on how you think that's worked out? Like you've kind of said the residents suffer.
Well, I'm not, I mean, you can see that the ambition of the building was that he's poured a huge amount of attention into the public spaces, that is the main atrium, and then the glazed galleria along the east and west side of the building. And then by adding the big north wing, he creates this kind of monstrous corridor building that gave lots more offices light, but then only in the dining hall actually has a kind of major assembly space. The problem in these cases is that the aspiration is to see atria and galleria as communal space and space where people can gather and space where people can meet and encounter each other. And I mean, I have to say that, you know, at some dimension it works, because usually when I walk through this building, I run into someone I know. I mean, just walk through the atrium, I almost always run into someone I know. And on the upper floors, I mean, they're big, open, light spaces. They're supposed to work that way. I think that in many cases, though, when architects create these spaces, they're meant to do this, and they're sort of symbols of community and symbols of contact and I mean, they're more a metaphor than an instrument for this. And, you know, it should have worked better than it does. And one of the things that I thought as I looked at the plans for these buildings over the last few weeks was, or for this building over the last few weeks, was there's a huge disjunction between the large spaces and the small spaces. You know, the small spaces have very little quality. And the big spaces are supposed to have tons of quality. They're supposed to be colorful, they're supposed to be light, they're supposed to be animated, and to some extent they are.
That's freezing.
Hmm?
That's freezing in the winter.
Yeah, cold. No, it's, you know, let's face it. Heating and cooling that volume is really hard. I mean, you know, it is funny. Architecture went through this period where it was, you know, dominated by preoccupations with efficiency and economy, and so things got smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, I always like looking at the buildings that were designed in the 50s by modern architects who are really driven by a notion of not just efficiency, but doing things with modesty and some restraint. But of course, over time, that modesty and restraint just starts to be boring and constrictive. And so we get, especially after '67, we get this architecture that re-aspires to a kind of monumentality. And this building, you know, really has a monumental ambition. I mean, it has a great atrium. It has these gallerias, like 19th century gallerias. You know, it was inspired in that respect by the Eaton Center, which has the same ambition. But no one tries to heat the whole galleria of the Eaton Center, right? And here you're in a kind of ambiguous scale where these huge monumental spaces, if you consider them as sort of partially exterior, it's perhaps acceptable that you're freezing them. But you know, this is I mean, it clearly was Ron's attempt to inject a new sense of the presence of technology and public spirit. You know, what's public about the Math and Computer Building? I mean, what's public? Where do you go to assemble in a building like that? Go to Heggie Hall. Like, the public space was a courtyard that you couldn't really get into, and now they're filling in. You know, I mean, go to PAS. Does anybody know that there's a giant roof terrace in PAS with a theater and all? But how do you get to it? There's a little door beside a stairwell near an elevator, and the Dean of Arts once took me out there and said, "What do we do with this?" Like, and I'm going, I was 22 years right beside the building. I had no idea. Like, the problem is, how do you make a building that pays some respect to the community, the communal, and creates public spaces if the public spaces are inaccessible and invisible, like they are in PAS, like they were on the top of, I mean, who knew there was a theater, even on top of the engineering lecture hall? Who knew there was an outdoor theater up there? We did, because architecture students drink a lot and explore places and maybe use other intoxicants to get them. But anyway, I mean, it's a very good point. What they wanted to do was find a new expression of public space and collectivity in the University of Waterloo. And I mean, it's not, you know, look, I think there are all kinds of problems with this building, and but on the other hand, they got some things right, and they actually understood that the future of this campus was not the North Campus, but the East Campus. And they knew that 20, 30 years before anyone else really understood it. And I think, you got to hand that to them at least.
How would you feel about changing the actual building in any form? That particular elevation, there was a proposal 5 years ago, nothing's come about it, to extend about 75 feet towards the ring road, in addition onto the library, to provide additional study and meeting space. Do you think that building should be left untouched?
No. I mean, and even Ron, Ron has a huge ego, bless his heart. But I think he would want it to be understood that this is an assembly. It's not a complete and finite sort of Beaux-Arts plan that can't be tinkered with. I mean, this is at one level, this is a very generic building. I mean, it's basically an H-shaped plan with the two gallerias running north and south and the atrium across it. And then, otherwise, I mean, there's some figured space in the building like this room and the fishbowl and others. But essentially, otherwise, it's very generic. And I think, actually, the university needs a strategy overall for addressing the east side of the ring road and the west and the other side of the ring road too. Like here's the way my life is, right? So I go to an engineering meeting and Adil Sedra hands out a plan that shows the location for Engineering 5. And I'm looking at this plan and I'm thinking, what the hell is it doing so far from the road? Like, bring it up, make it part of the campus. And so I'm trying to figure out why the building was located where it was. And then I realized that they've drawn the plan right on an existing plan of the campus. And the footprint of the building, who can tell me what determined the footprint of that building? The curb line of B1, of the B parking lot. Of that parking lot. They projected up the lines of the curbs from the parking lot. So I called Adil and I said, look, Adil, you can't do that. Like, this building has to be located somewhere. You can't just build it on the curb lines of the parking lot. Those are just lines on a page. So that was actually what provoked them to hire Urban Strategies to do the last master plan for the campus, which unfortunately was done before the LRT and before there were 32 high-rise buildings built within 15 minutes walk of the Waterloo campus. So whatever else, and of course they didn't follow it anyway. So, but it was interesting. And then it turned out, so they did bring the building forward, but they could only bring it forward so much because, of course, as you know, that swamp there is a regionally protected wetland and stormwater management feature. So it's there forever, apparently. But to your point, I really think that the East, The ring road on the west side has been accruing buildings, so the buildings have just been built out to the ring road, and there's no idea that there's a kind of promenade along that side, or that there's a sort of picturesque walkway with park on one side and buildings on the other. But it's close enough. This side is the side that people need to start thinking about. What's going to happen here when there's a train, an LRT running through here? What's going to, what's it going to be like to walk up and down this side of the campus? Because this is the center axis of the campus now. I mean, de facto, this is the central axis of the campus. And whatever you do up that kind of irregular pathway from South Campus Hall up to Applied Health Science is not, I mean, it is what it is. There's not much you can do. Well, you could tear down South Campus Hall, which, by the way, was the first recommendation I made when I came to be director of the School of Architecture, because it would save the money to do it, which it would have, because they could have designed a proper entrance to the campus, and it would have meant they didn't have to spend money re-waterproofing the building, renovating the food services, blah, blah. Would have saved them about 50%. But anyway, I once tried to resign from the President's Advisory Committee on Design, and Dennis, my dear friend Dennis Huber, said, well, Rick, if you resign, the committee won't have any credibility. And I said, but Dennis, you never followed my advice anyway, so what credibility do I have? So what can I say? I have this incredible desire to, well, like what I can say, we had this period starting with the Davis Center, and then there were a series of buildings that were done, the TPO, ENCE, Quantum Nano, and a couple of others that were done through a kind of rigorous architect selection and competition, pharmacy. But now we don't do that. Now the University of Waterloo hires architects. They don't hire architects, they hire design builders. And the contractor goes out and gets an architect who is willing to work on a project like this, and many good architects aren't, because they don't have any control. So I still believe in Waterloo profoundly, and one of the things that it makes me want to do is influence the campus for the better. You know what? One last little secret about the Davis Center. When the thing started to go over budget, the university hired an accountant to come on board to control the costs. Does anyone know who that accountant was? Dennis Huber. Dennis Huber. So the Davis Center is the threshold to the campus in every way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.